Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Sanek. I'm the Acting Director of the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Program here at CSIS. And on behalf of CSIS, I would like to welcome you to today's conference on innovative immigration and border control reform. Thank you for joining us in this discussion. Before I begin, I would like to thank CSC, Ping Identity, and Equifax for their for sponsoring this conference. In particular, I would like to single out Laura Reese, John Fitzgerald, and Sally Ewalt of those companies for their incredible support in putting this conference together. This support has allowed us to host this important and timely discussion, but it's also allowing us to build on a conference we had 1 year ago, last month, on rethinking identity management. I'd also like to thank the great lineup of panelists who have agreed to share their insights and observations with us throughout this afternoon. Out of respect for their contributions, if you wouldn't all, let me try that again. If you all wouldn't mind either turning your cell phones to silent or stun, I would really appreciate it. This topic, immigration and border reform, is a very sensitive one that will touch the lives of many people, both U.S. citizens and non-citizens. As expected, this issue set is gathering steam and is creating somewhat a contentious policy debate here in D.C. However, solving policy questions is made all the more difficult by existing immigration and border control processes, from everything from verifying immigration status to granting visas and screening those entering the country. These processes, some people argue, are neither as secure nor as efficient as they should be. Some have suggested that technological innovation holds the potential to address these challenges and process deficiencies and alleviate some of the policy challenges that surround immigration and border control reform. To discuss the topic of technological innovation for immigration and border control reform, we are joined by several experts from a wide variety of backgrounds. We'll begin today with a keynote discussion featuring 3 former senior government officials who bring with them strategic perspectives on the issues at hand. Following that, there will be a panel discussion on the factors driving technological reform, and our final panel will talk about areas and applications for technological innovation in this area. To moderate our keynote panel, we are joined by Susan Ginsburg. Susan is a non-resident fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, where she headed the Mobility and Security Program. She is a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Quadrennial Review Advisory Committee and served on the Secure Borders and Open Doors Advisory Committee. Prior to joining MPI, Ms. Ginsburg served as senior counsel and team leader on the staff of the 9/11 Commission, where she was responsible for research and policy recommendations concerning the entry of the 9/11 hijackers, terrorist travel, and border control. Susan, thank you for joining us today and for moderating today's keynote discussion. I turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for including me today. I'm delighted to be here with some of the leaders of technology innovation in the border and immigration area. My 3 distinguished panelists, I'm going to introduce the topic and each of them, ask them to speak for a few minutes each, and we'll go in just in sequence, and I'll ask the next one to begin when the prior one is ended. I'll make the summary comment and maybe ask a couple of questions or one question, and then we'll take questions from the group. I'll start with Jay Ahern. He's a principal of the Chertoff Group. He provides advice on a range of homeland security matters, and he's retired as the acting commissioner of CBP after 33 years of service. And he oversaw a 58,000 person workforce and $11 billion budget. I don't think we'll be giving him any trouble today. Julie Myers-Wood, President, Compliance Federal Practice and Software Solutions of Guidepost Solutions, a security and technology company focused on the private sector. So she's an expert in the issues we'll be discussing today. She has specifically developed products to assist employers with compliance issues. And she served as director of ICE for 3 years, 17,000 employees, and a $5 billion budget, a real leader. Julie has also held leadership positions in export enforcement, criminal prosecution, and money laundering regulation, all of which are relevant to the set of problems we're confronting. Michael Petruccelli, Executive Chairman and President of ClearPath. which is providing a simple and direct online process for accessing immigration benefits. And as a lawyer, I'm going to ask him, are you trying to move lawyers out of the process?
Never do so.
He ended his 3-year service at Citizenship and Immigration Service as the acting director. He has formerly served at the Exim Bank, the FCC, and in a variety of posts supporting U.S.-Asia trade relations. So we really have a global perspective from him. Each one of these people has a deep professional perspective on one or more of the 4 pillars of comprehensive immigration reform. Jay Ahern on securing the border, Julie Myers on workplace enforcement and enforcement of overstay rules, and Michael Petruccelli on path to citizenship and legal immigration and registration, and of course, all of them on all of the above, but especially those. So I'd like to ask each of them to address perhaps the technology innovations that may or may not come into play to support the pillar of immigration of immigration reform with which they are the most familiar from their own experience, and to maybe talk about a very positive experience they've had with technology innovation and maybe a negative side, one of the problems they have faced. So we'll start with Jay, securing the border.
Okay. On that last point, as far as problems, I would look at those as challenges or opportunities to improve.
Right,
as opposed
of
to
course.
some of the negatives. You know, thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to talk about some of these things, but it's even more a pleasure to talk about these things and not have to be an accountable government official to go ahead and oversee some of these responsibilities. And I say that not to be flip or funny in any way, but it's to really, you know, kind of put how serious and how difficult these matters are out there. You know, certainly you all know that there's kind of the 4 common principles that are out there, common sense principles for, you know, comprehensive immigration reform going forward. And this is not the this is the most recent iteration, but it's not the only one that's happened in recent time. Talking about securing the border, I would argue that certainly there's been tremendous efforts over the last several years to add more security and gain operational control of the border. But those things are very subjective factors as far as what level of control is appropriate for building upon, you know, a comprehensive program. And I think it's important to just take a look at the accomplishments, but also acknowledge the job is not yet complete and more needs to be done. But reflecting back on the substantial investments that have been made, certainly you all know a lot of the information that has been stated repeatedly through congressional testimony, media, constant discussions going back into the 07-08 timeframe when this was last considered. But just to refresh some of you on that, you know, the doubling of the size of the Border Patrol has been substantial. When you look at, you know, the 2000 period when there was 9,100, today there is over 21,000. So the boots on the ground that's referred to, and I saw some recent articles and quotes by Secretary Napolitano that are very accurate. The resources that have been put to this fight have gained very significant security enhancements and operational control measures for the border. But again, more needs to be done. The 650 miles of fence, as controversial as it was, and as difficult as it was to move through not only just some of the political issues and some of the public issues, but also the environmental issues, to go ahead and get the permits to be able to make that construction. I see a couple of friendly faces in the crowd that were part of that and nodding their heads of how challenging that was. That has been tremendous as far as really having a persistent capability in areas where we had significant gaps in this border, where we had drive-throughs that were actually running over and killing our agents in the field. Those things are not occurring to that level. I think the other thing to take a look at, the investments that have been made for installing tactical roads that the Border Patrol agents can get to some of these remote areas in a much more efficient and safe fashion to be able to apprehend individuals who have actually caused an incursion on our border, and stadium lighting. Talking about technology, significant amount of technology, and certainly this is not just the SBI or SBI Net or the P28 or some of the programs that were out in the past. I'll leave everyone to their own opinions on that, but I would argue, again, that a lot of the technology that's been brought to bear on the border has actually added that component part of that 3 leg of the stool, the personnel. I talked about the Border Patrol numbers, the infrastructure. I talked about the 650 miles of fence, the tactical roads, but also the technology. And it's more than just tower-mounted technology. It also is mobile surveillance systems. Also, I think that it needs to be acknowledged, too, that the investment of technology that's been made for the aerial surveillance and patrols along the border, not just the 270 aircraft, the light helicopters, the tactical helicopters, the citations, as well as P3s, 16 P3s that were actually given life extensions These are 1966 era aircraft based in Corpus Christi and also in Jacksonville, Florida, to do transit zone activity, to stop the movement of drugs and the flow of aliens deep into the transit zone on its way to the United States through Central South America, Caribbean, and Mexico. Those are critical assets that have been deployed in recent years against this fight. The 9 UAVs that DHS and CBP now have patrolling the borders and conducting operations on the border to give, again, the overhead surveillance and also helping to identify, but also providing safety and situational awareness back to command centers for the agents deployed in the field. Those are key pieces for some of the technological investments. I think when you take a look at the numbers, the numbers, you can make your own determination of what the numbers actually indicate. But when you look at the fiscal year 12 numbers, 360,000 apprehensions actually shows that it's a 78% decrease from when it was at its high in the 2000 timeframe. It's a 50% decrease of what it was back in the 2008 timeframe. And while if you look closely, there was an 8% increase in the 2012 numbers over the 2011 numbers, I'm not sure that an 8% increase all of a sudden should be cause for alarm. It could be any number of factors that show why the increase in apprehensions went up by 8%, 12 over 11. Could be becoming more effective. Could be as far as a variety of different other smuggling issues that are out there, but I would just watch that very closely, but I would look more importantly at that downward trend over the last several years. I think this other key thing, when you take a look at what's the net flow, 360,000 people were apprehended, and ICE, through their removal operations, put over 409,000 people out of the country in the fiscal year 12 period. So just net, you take a look, 360 caught, 409 removed. That's not the same population, obviously, but that just shows as far as that population may be actually moving in the right direction when you take a look at those numbers. All the while, as you take a look at the apprehension numbers in border security, you can't eliminate the amount of drugs that come across the border or the amount of money that goes out of the country across the borders. So $4.2 million in drugs seized last year, $100 million in currency seized, all tied to drug trade activity going forward. But what gets lost oftentimes in the argument on border security is the focus between the ports of entry and what goes on with the Border Patrol and the numbers there. So again, keep in mind the 360,000 apprehensions. But at ports of entry last year, there was over 145,000 individuals that were denied admission coming into the country. These are not just technical violations. There was 7,700 individuals for criminal activity, murder, rape, robbery, burglary. You also had people that were not just, as far as, again, technical overstays or technically inadmissible. These are individuals who were smuggled into trunks of car, in the engine compartments of trucks coming across the border. Fraud and imposters that actually coming across the borders through the ports of entry. What does that tell me? I started in the 70s, so I've had a chance to watch this over 4 decades. What it tells me from my experience is that you are having a displacement effect on some of the smuggling patterns that are actually occurring on the border because of all the infrastructure, the personnel and technology that's been deployed between the ports of entry. And you're now having that funneling effect into the ports. You also see the effect of what's happening when you see the kind of the proliferation of tunnel activity that's occurred over the last couple of years, much more so than we might have seen in years past. It's not a new phenomena, but the numbers actually have spiked up very, very significantly. And just to focus on one piece of the border, the San Diego sector, I think the apprehensions for fiscal year 12 were around 50,000 by the Border Patrol. At the port of entry, there was 25,000 people determined to be inadmissible. Again, these are very predominant smuggling cases that were occurring with people, again, putting people's life in danger and endangering people coming across the border because it's so difficult to get into what was previously a pretty open opportunity for folks to come into the country. So when you take a look at what was deployed in those areas, it's one of the most secure because there's double fencing, a tactical road in between, stadium lighting, persistent patrol of Border Patrol back and forth, camera technology. But we also have seen that as one of the most significant areas where tunnels have actually been tunneled into the warehouses on the U.S. side, feeding from the Mexican side, and also another displacement effect into the maritime domain. You're seeing a lot of the Pongo boats, the small boats with aliens and also with drugs, ending up in Torrey Pines and La Jolla and other places up in the Southern California coast. That's a good indicator that we're having an effect, but also it should be also a concern that this is an adaptable threat, which will continue to move and adapt to what provisions the government has going forward. I think the last point I would make is beyond as far as just the efforts that is happening at the borders. We shouldn't focus just physically on the southern border with Mexico. We should take a look at the entire domain. 350 million people come to this country each year. 97 million come in by air. That's a pretty significant spike over what it was in the post-9/11 time, and it's grown pretty rapidly going forward. So we need to make sure as far as that we find that not only just an efficient process, but also a secure one. So some of the targeting systems and the methodology that have been put in place actually have kept 4,100 identified individuals of potential risk or that would be inadmissible upon arrival. They've been preventing them from board onto aircraft destined to the United States through the targeting systems and through the overseas deployed resources. That's a positive thing, because living through the many threats that were in the aviation sector, keeping people that could present harm to civil aviation safety and security and people on board, it's a pretty big deal. And that also is a big piece of border security going forward. So we need to continue to do that, but also, how do you sort some of the compliant population out? Taking a look at the trusted traveler programs and other partnership programs. There's 1.5 million people now engaged with trusted traveler programs coming across land borders and by air. So the more you can sort through your compliant travelers and people that want to go ahead and provide information so they can go through a background check, a vetting process, an interview to be able to put into a separate category, that's great news. While it's not enough when you look at that 350 million population, it does show a wiser, more efficient way to go ahead and sort that traffic. So again, you can use your resources and your technology on areas you don't know as much about. And then finally, other partnerships, Canada and Mexico, or key areas. Certainly other bilateral agreements with different parts of the world are important for border security. It does not just begin at our physical borders. Certainly there's been the latest iteration with Canada for beyond the borders. There's also been constant efforts with Mexico to try to control the borders there. And I'm very, very encouraged by what I see continuing to happen in Mexico. While there's been 70,000 deaths since December of 2006, too many, more than any place in the world. You do need to take a look as far as what actually Mexico is doing or can be doing more of to secure our own border. Because it is defense in depth. It is the layers of security. It does not just physically begin with putting fence or more people on our southern border. And it's not just through things such as the Myriad initiative. It's seeing what Mexico can do to secure its southern border with Guatemala. What can it do with its maritime borders? What can they do with people arriving from countries of risk when they don't have a visa requirement? Those are important things, and I think there's a lot of positive activity going there that will add security to our own border by having that partnership program with a country like Mexico. So there's just a few opening thoughts.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Jay. I mean, you talked about two things. One, the systems that are primarily dedicated to security, and then the question of metrics. And how we're using technology to get the measures we need to make decisions about what is still needed. And you characterized illegal entry as an adaptable threat, which makes the metrics and what we're deciding to measure and what we're concluding as a consequence of those measures very, very important and a very difficult and complicated question. So, Julie, maybe you could talk also a little bit about the technologies that are at stake for ICE going forward for enforcement and for feasible and acceptable employer identification.
Sure. Thank you so much, Susan, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here. And it's really encouraging, actually, to hear Jay talk about the areas where there has been kind of consistent progress made at the border. And I think one of the advantages that we have when we think about traditional border security, north and south border, is that there's broader agreement that it has to be done, right? It has to be done, it has to be done well. And so there has been a kind of a steady stream of funding and emphasis and focus on that. When it comes to people that are in this country legally but then overstay their visa, or people who are not authorized working in this, but are working in this country, unauthorized workers, there's not agreement. And so I think one of the big challenges, a threshold challenge, when we think about what kind of technology we can use, there's a lot of great things out there that could be very effective, but what does our country want to have done? And what is something that the American people would agree upon that would be useful and workable for the business community and that would make sense in the long term? And I think that's a very important thing that has to be looked at and thought about in comprehensive immigration reform in order to have effective technology. I also think a guiding principle when you think about worksite enforcement and overstays is what sort of technology are you using and how will it work for the business community? And that's all the business community, not just businesses that are in downtown high-rises in Chicago, but also construction sites where all the workers may be remote, or employers that are hiring just virtual workers. Is this something that business can use, whether it's for their H-1Bs or for their traditional workers, and is it easy for them to do so? If it's not, then you're not going to have the kind of rate of adapting to that technology that you'd want to have. And we've got to make sure that we're looking at not just what is easy for the government to do in terms of technology or what they would like, but what's workable kind of from a business perspective. And I also think we have to keep in mind another guiding principle when we think about overstays and technology and worker enforcement and technology is the new immigrant population, and sometimes the challenges that they may have in using any technology that's applied to them in order to determine whether or not they're authorized to work. I think of a number of companies that I've been working with lately who are moving to an electronic payroll system, where instead of getting your pay stub mailed to you or delivered to you, now you have to go on your computer, on your PDA, and there's a link to a website where you enter your information and then you can pull up your pay stub. My company actually uses that same system. There's ADP does it, a lot of systems do it. Well, what we found is that a lot of employers that have a lot of new immigrants working for them find that system very challenging. They may be at workplaces where there's a manufacturing floor where people don't have computers at their desks. These employees may not have PDAs. Many of them who are employment authorized, eligible to work, also can't speak English or speak English very well, and so they're very frustrated by the system. And so it's been very interesting for me to see the challenges that these companies have had moving to an electronic payroll system, which I think makes a lot of sense, right? It's very green, but can be very challenging. And so you think, well, how do we make sure when advancing E-Verify or making other improvements to our employer authorization system, how do we make sure that the people we want most protected, our new asylees, our new refugees, those who are newly authorized to work in this country, that they're going to be able to use this system, that it will work in middle America, not just in downtown. So that I think is a very important kind of guiding principle we have to think about for technology in this area in particular. And a third guiding principle I would really say is, I think we've seen data analytics really transform law enforcement even in the last 10 years. If you think about what ICE and former INS and customs agents had when I was a prosecutor back in the late 90s, when someone came in the airport, you had the paper I-94, where most of the fields were optional, pre-9/11, and so someone could say that they were going to stay in the Marriott, no location, no place, anything else, the Marriott. The person would commit a crime, you'd have the I-94, you're looking at it. Could you find that person from just the description of a Marriott? Of course not. Of course that's not the kind of thing that's usable. Could you run and check a lot of information, run it through a lot of systems? No, because the computer systems didn't talk to each other, and a lot of that information wasn't even in the system. So it was really, really tough. Now we've moved to where a lot of the fields on an I-94 are mandatory. A lot of that information is kept electronically, and the internet, of course, and other data analytics skills have allowed us to do searches on if someone says a certain place, we can make checks and do additional work. And so it's really transformed, I think, law enforcement over the past 10 years, just really basic data analytics. But you have garbage in, garbage out. So you've got to make sure in whatever you do for worker enforcement and looking at visa overstays that you have integrity of that information. Because the problem we would have today, if someone fills out an I-94 and puts they're staying at the JW Marriott in, I think it's on Pennsylvania, something in Pennsylvania Avenue, we would not be able to verify that, right? We wouldn't be able to check it. And also if they stayed there 2 nights and then go somewhere else, we wouldn't know. And so, you've got to make sure that the information coming in is appropriate and accurate information for the purposes that law enforcement wants to know. And so, what does law enforcement need to know in order to keep our country secure and in order to make sure that people don't violate their visas? Do we need to know where they stay every night? Or for certain categories of visas, do we just need to know when they're finishing up a visa, are they remaining enrolled in school, or that kind of thing? Another area where I think technology has really transformed ICE over the last few years is looking at the student visa program. If you think about how students used to be managed, it was very form-centric versus person-centric. So, if I want to come to school in the U.S., I'm filling out an I-20 to go study at one school. If I want to study at a different school, I fill out another I-20, and there was no way to track that. It was tracked by forms. Now, of course, the system is more person-centric. So you're tracking one person through the system. That's very important because students, of course, can be, that age group could be a high-risk population in terms of potential criminal activity. So we want to know what they're doing, what they're looking at. Is there more to be done in this area? Absolutely. But I think that is a way that technology is kind of starting to transform in a very positive way for law enforcement and frankly, for the schools who are looking at, potential violators, potential people who won't stay in class and follow things. Another area that I wanted to focus on, which I think has both been a positive and where there's some room for improvement, certainly is E-Verify. And if you think about back in 2007, when it was changed from basic pilot to E-Verify, you had about 26,000 employers on E-Verify. So, a few employers were on E-Verify. A lot of them were meat packers that had gotten in trouble in the early 90s and were kind of forced to go on the old basic pilot program. This past year, there were over 352,000 employers that are on E-Verify, thanks in large part to the mandate that federal contractors go on E-Verify, the push of both the Bush administration and the Obama administration to really equip employers and encourage employers to go on E-Verify. And I think, frankly, the improvements that USCIS and its partners have made to the E-Verify system to make it easier and more user-friendly. If you use E-Verify today, almost everybody, I think it's 98 or 99%, come back immediately, and what do they say? It says employment authorized, but are they really? And that's the fundamental problem and question that's still missing kind of from E-Verify. You know that if you're an employer and you have a foreign worker who who provides a green card, an I-551, as a list A document, it will come back with a photo ID that you can compare. You can compare the photo on their card to the photo that's in the system. So that person is employment authorized. But if I come in, even today, and I provide a driver's license from the state of Kansas and a social security card, and all the information is correct, but it's Susan's name and social security number, it'll come back as employment authorized, even though I'm engaging in identity theft. And I know that USCIS has really tried to address this through the RIDE program, but and that's getting DMVs and others to provide driver's license information. But the DMVs haven't been eager to do that. So far we're at Mississippi and now Florida, and that's not the whole country, and that's not going to prevent identity theft. And so what you have is a technology that's good, but it opens up a vulnerability and a problem. So that employers are having to ask themselves, well, are they really employment authorized? What else do I have to do? And the private sector has actually stepped in with a number of private sector solutions, including automatic verification, other identity verification tools, interview processes, and other sorts of things. That's difficult. Employers aren't made to be document detectives, and your $12 an hour clerks aren't very good at figuring out, is the font on this social security card, really Courier or Times New Roman or something else? Is the font appropriate? So I think that's an area where really comprehensive immigration reform has to focus and has to look at. And there are a lot of ways to do that. Obviously anything from, you can take anything from a national ID card down to a very simple identity authentication quiz, like is used in a number of private software tools, down to a mandatory DMV program like RIDE. Although that's not perfect without a photograph, of course, but it does get us a long way there. But I think looking at how can we build up E-Verify is really going to make a broad difference for worksite enforcement, making sure that workers are there. I think that worksite enforcement is an area where the government hasn't gotten it right. When I came into ICE, there was virtually no worksite enforcement at all. The INS had really stopped doing that, and ICE continued the pattern of no worksite enforcement at all in the early days. I think about 70,000 or so in worksite fines in 2002 and only 25 criminal cases. When I was there, we tried to focus on criminal cases. So we brought about 30 million in civil forfeitures for several years and some big high-profile criminal cases. But those took a lot of time, and it wasn't high volume because we also addressed the issue of the illegal workers. The Obama administration has tried to focus on the civil audits. I think that's really raised the awareness to the 4,000 companies that have been audited and a few more. But with the median cost of a fine being only about $11,000, some employers are starting to think, it's not worth it. It's just the cost of doing business, and if I have to fire workers, that's okay, because I can do it over a period of time, and then those workers just move down the road. So I think both my predecessor, my successor, and I all tried to combat that, but I think we haven't done it effectively enough. And I think for comprehensive immigration reform to stick and to work, that's an area that really needs to be focused on. And I think that's an area where technology can really make a transformative difference, especially if we put the burden back on the government, take it away from the employee. I know Lamar Smith last year proposed doing away with the I-9. That makes a lot of sense. You think about somebody who does E-Verify and something can come back and says the worker is employment authorized, that employer still has to fill out an I-9, right? The employer still has to fill out an I-9, they can still be fined. Even though they did E-Verify, the person is authorized, they knew the person was work authorized, that makes no sense. I mean, why are we glorifying a piece of paper? What do we care about? We care about reducing the magnet, and we can do that, I think, very simply through technology.
Okay. Well, thank you, Julie. I mean, you raised another theme that's really important, which is when you've got data analytics, which are enormously powerful, it's very key to figure out what information you actually need, and to understand what is actually being done with that information in order to make it useful and in order to make it cost efficient. And you also raised the issue of just the logic of these systems and the incentives that they are creating, both of which are really important. So Michael, we get to talk with you about the really satisfying part of immigration reform, which is admitting people.
That's why you get the bigger cup.
So tell us something about how technology is going to make that more possible politically.
Sure. Well, I think, I know we're speaking here at a time where we still have a number of different outlines out there about what immigration reform is going to look like, whether it's the White House version, the House version, the Senate version, Republicans, Democrats. So we don't know exactly what the shape of it will be, but I think we can speak in certain generalities and be fairly on target. Some of the stuff that was brought up as we've moved through the arc from enforcement to the benefit side speaks very much to what goes on that on the USCIS side of things as well. We don't have anybody up here from TSA, so I'll give them an attaboy. How about that? And say that their efforts at something like TSA Pre, while arguably not perfect, are a step in that right direction. It's about synthesizing that kind of trusted traveler information, merging what CBP has with what the frequent flyer programs have, coming up with this verified set of data that is, as Julie was saying, very person-centric, and leveraging into a tangible benefit that most of the people in this room would like to consume. So that movement of technology, I think, is very important, and we'll see that certainly played out in immigration reform. Whatever the other features are going to be, and I don't know how much of this rather large basket of change is going to be included ultimately in any new law, but I think if you just start with the idea that there are going to be a group of people that are already here who we're going to do something with, whether you want to call it regularization or earned residency or amnesty or whatever you want to call it, there's a really large population of people that are going to have to come out of the shadows and into the light, and they're going to have, as a part of that, their identity verified. I think at that point, many people look back to 1986, and I think that while there are maybe several of us in the room that would argue that that's a bad thing when it comes to music and some elements of fashion, it's a great thing when it comes to technology, because we're not back in those days at all, and we do have ways of going out and helping people create an identity where they either didn't have one or it was not their identity before. So taking people into the system is really going to be the major challenge, whether that process has 4 steps, 3 steps, 2 steps. But there are 2 very important constituencies there, and I think we've alluded to it in this conversation already. You have the applicants themselves, right? Whoever is going to apply for whatever is included here, whether it's I want to go from documented or undocumented to documented, or I'm documented but I want to change status, or I'm overseas and I want to access a new program, whether it's a entrepreneurial visa or a STEM category, or I would argue maybe even things that we don't have yet, gaps in the system. You can't really self-petition for anything, and that's, as we've moved into a global workforce that is very activity-based and not geography-based. We see that in this country, right? Hoteling, things like that. The sort of I go sit in an office and do my thing is really not the norm anymore. And so we don't have an avenue for people who are doing, who want to come in and do something to do it the right way. So that intake process of figuring out what is it that I'm being asked, how can I provide the information, and get away from sort of big open spaces. When you're talking about the Marriott and how do we know which one that is, taking advantage of giving people more clarity about the fields they're being asked. That certainly a ClearPath, that's what we do. But I took a look at the new design for the I-90 that USCIS came out with the other day, and it's really nice to have a field that instead of says what was your destination when you arrived, big blank space, right? Because it reminds you of driving with your parents and having someone say, go to where the big maple tree used to be, turn left, and you can't give people an open-ended answer and then process what they think is the right answer to that. And if you want city and state, tell people, I just want a city and a state. That speeds it up and gets a lot of that junk information out of the system. So giving the population that's going to access this immigration reform the tools to be able to input their information very swiftly, I think is going to be absolutely key. Because what my colleagues here and their former teams want to do is cull through that data and start looking for the proverbial needles in the haystack. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is by shrinking the haystack very swiftly. So giving people a way that's very user-friendly to come in, enter data, and have it be taken into the system and create a new trusted identity for themselves will be, and then move that identity around through the system will be absolutely key. And we have the internet and we have mobile devices. Mobile devices are not great for sitting down and entering, we have all done this, right? You try to send a long email or text message and it tests your patience and your battery life. But they're excellent for sending information back out to people. Here's your authorization. Here's your boarding pass. We've already figured out how to do that in the rest of our lives, travel, banking, insurance. So that piece of it, I think, we have a number of excellent options for taking care of that registration and processing piece in a way that we didn't have in prior efforts at undertaking a task of this magnitude. The second constituency I would mention is the one that's by extension by all of us being up here, which is the government employees that are going to have to deal with this. I would offer the suggestion that whatever the eventual shape of this reform is, we have to be conscious that I know it sounds like a lot, 58,000, 15,000, 18,000 people, but they're already running at max capacity. And to try to ask them to tackle 5, 6, 7 absolutely brand new processes, along with the steady state of what they're already trying to process every year, strikes me as being less than optimal. So to try to leverage the kinds of things that we're doing already and make them better, I think is really where we need to go. There's somebody from the State Department, I think, on a later panel who can probably speak to this in more direct and granular detail than I can. But when you get down into the guts of the things, I see Joe Cudahy in the back there, and maybe Joe will regale us with tales of Claims 3 and its the summits that it scales and the depths to which it sinks. But these are systems that have been in need of repair and overhaul for years and years and years and years. They only run at a certain speed, and we can't get past it. We have to be able to integrate with it so that we have some hope of not creating a massive logjam on the other end. And that plays into this idea of what the back of the line means. I'm sure we'll get to that in question and answer. But when we say to people, come and do this thing that we're asking you to do, come out of the darkness and into the light, I think we have to be very specific about what we're telling them to do and how to do it. You know, if someone said to me, get to the back of the line when it comes to immigration benefits, my first question would be, what line? Because I don't know unless we're talking about my country of origin and a family-based preference or an employment-based preference. There are many lines. Is it the 24-year line? Is it the 3-year line? And what if it's none of the above? What if I don't have the situations that would allow me under the existing framework to apply for one of those? What line do you want me to get in? The new line? And how do you start feeding that line into a system and appropriately assign people their number at the deli counter? Those are going to be massive tasks. So to the extent that we can offer those that have to process all of this the opportunity to stay within the kinds of adjudicative processes that they already understand, but leverage new and better technology, I think that would be great. You know, I look to the example of cooperation again with the State Department, when you can sit down now, at least on a limited basis, and compare what you see at USCIS or ICE or CBP with what state is taking in on the front end, and be able to compare what somebody said about where they're staying, what the purpose of their visit is, are they traveling with relatives or not. That is very helpful. However, I can tell you, having been a Foreign Service officer out there doing visa interviews and having sat back on the USCIS end, giving me the ability to manually sort data is better than not. But what would be a whole lot better is giving me an automated dashboard system that is only going to flag something that I need to look at, so that I don't have to comb through it myself. So, you know, those are some opening thoughts. I know we have a whole lot that we haven't talked about: diversity visas, refugees, potential for same-sex marriage benefits, and all that kind of stuff. And I know we'll get into that in the Q&A. But you know, trying to tackle a group of people of the anticipated size that we're talking about, whichever flavor of reform you want to push to the forefront, that has to depend on technology. We have to be very conscious of drawing the line about what is inherently governmental very close to the decision tree. Otherwise, we'll overwhelm all of these systems, plus state and justice too, very, very quickly.
Well, thank you very much, and I think you raised a theme that's really, really important, which is the individual and the individualization of travel and work, and how the system needs to think about that and accommodate that more effectively than it has. I would just like to raise a couple of questions to ask one or more of you to think about or say something about. We haven't talked about information or cybersecurity, which with the Department of Energy and the Federal Reserve, you know, reporting intrusions, massive intrusions recently, has to be a concern with our immigration system as well. And on the other side of that, perhaps the issue of privacy, again, a very cross-cutting issue across all the systems, continued tension with Europe and other allies over privacy standards. How are we going to create a global governance that accommodates these questions? And I think you've all alluded to some extent, the way in which the different agencies need to work together. And obviously, the three of you have had a very good working relationship. But it's not always so. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on structural incentives for agencies to work better, who, again, in the end, address the same population of people, the traveler or the foreign immigrant. Jay, have any thoughts?
Which one of those 3 or 4 questions would you like me to do first?
Whichever one.
Let's talk about the, as you look particularly really in any component within the Department of Homeland Security, but I'll just speak because of my experience with the one I was attached to. When you pull as much information together as CBP does, when you take a look at trade information, the proprietary information that's in there about companies, pricing, who the relationships are, I can tell you from my experience in the last couple of years before I departed, and I've been gone a little over 3 years, we knew that there was penetrations that were occurring for people to try and extract the information on that, and that's a very serious issue. Now, as far as today, when you start to pull more information for people in the 1.5 million that are involved with trusted programs, does that potentially set itself up as a target? I think the answer is yes. Don't have any specific firsthand knowledge, being 3 years departed, but I think all the information that's in a system presents itself as a likely target for people to try to gain access for whatever, illegal means or purposes that they have to use that data. So I think it's important, and I know the government is very focused on protecting that information. I think that's a key thing. On the privacy information, certainly we dealt a lot with some of our negotiations that were well chronicled with the EU on getting passenger name record information and keeping that information within our databases, and the privacy issue and the concerns that were raised not only by the EU officials but also by US officials as well. And I know that having audit mechanisms and having the right protocols in place to make sure, as far as the people who have access to use that system have legitimate access and only use it for that purpose. So setting up an audit trail within the system to make sure that that is well laid out, so that there is kind of a forensic tail to be able to go back and look at how the information is used, should give some of the privacy concerns should be allayed by some of the capabilities that have been put into the system. Again, from 3 years departed, I know it has to have progressed much more in the last 37, 38 months.
Mm-hmm. Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, as a starting point, I would note that I think all of the operational elements in DHS, whether it's the ones we're talking about here, or the Coast Guard, or the Secret Service, or FEMA, all have this essential tension between a customer service-oriented approach and the national security aspects of what the department is there to do. And that line moves a bit from operating component to operating component, and it is a very, very challenging line to find. How much can you give people the kinds of access that they're accustomed to in certain ways, right? I mean, if I have applied for an insurance policy or something and I go online, I can tell where I am in the process. I can get information. It's much less so in the immigration agency environment. It's better than it used to be. I can go into the CIS website and at least get know where I am within 5 very big chunks. Right? Not exactly where I am, but in a general sense, and that's very helpful. But all that information is out there, and it's probably not very hard to pull. Screen scraping and things like that, case numbers, names, all the stuff that we do normally to authenticate ourselves, and that's why coming up with better ways to create a single identity that I can access and have other multiple benefits and questions come into that source and figure out that I'm me, so that I'm not maintaining. I mean, I think it's wonderful that we've moved substantially towards an individualized account system, but if I were on the other side of this equation, I probably wouldn't want to have my account at CBP for ESTA, and my account at CIS, and my account at ICE, and my account at TSA, and everything else. There should be one source that I can access. In terms of breaches, first of all, we're well outside of my skill set when it comes to cybersecurity, but I assume there are a fair number of people in this room who, like me, are Bank of America customers, and like me, periodically get love notes from the Bank of America saying, sorry, we've been hacked. We're going to have to shut down the online banking for X number of days, and by the way, please come in and get a new credit card. We'll be sending it to you, and that sort of thing. So I don't know that there's one prophylaxis for creating cybersecurity within the department, because different parts of the department are going to have different needs for levels of security.
Mm-hmm.
I think they've almost said it all on.
Yeah.
You can talk about reorganizations or things of that nature.
Yes, please.
That's
I mean, I would agree with what both Jay and Michael said. I think in terms of kind of getting agencies to work together, and I think that is, no matter how much technology we have, that will probably continue to be a problem as long as you have human beings involved in some of the process. But finding kind of making sure that we have common goals, and then making sure people have access to the right amount of material. And I think data analytics and technology can help, so that you're not seeing too much. You're getting exactly the information that you need to make your decision, and not excess information, which then can kind of cause problems or concerns. But I think moving together for common goals and getting the leadership to agree on that is the best way to get the agencies to work together.
okay. Well, with that thought, I'm wondering if anyone here has some questions, and if you do, would you come to one of the 2 microphones and identify yourself and your organization?
Go ahead. Hi there. Teresa Round, Cardinal North Strategies. Michael.
Yes.
Both Jay and Julie mentioned funding streams for technology that have been applied to their enforcement operations at CBP and ICE. USCIS is fee-funded. And unlike those agencies which have a political process every year to deal with, you have a regulatory process at CIS that has to be gone through every year. How does that difference in funding impact the technologies that CIS has available to apply to what might be in CIR? And what options might there be to make additional investments?
Sure. Well, to begin with, I want to put your mind at ease that just because the process is different doesn't mean that those of us, some of us in this very room, haven't been called up to the hill to take our whippings for other things. So it's not a complete escape from the process of oversight and input. But I would argue that one of the key ways that it frees up USCIS is that USCIS, my view, and this is not, please, I'm in no way representing Ale Mayorkas or anybody else, this is just my personal view, has some latitude that other organizations don't have. And specifically, it has already demonstrated the ability to use an opt-in approach, right? If I choose to pay for premium processing, which in some cases is a very healthy dollar amount, that's already been tried, tested, and true. We understand sort of the ways in which you can apply the economics of the situation so that people can make informed choices. I think that when it comes then to experimenting with new technologies, USCIS does have some extra arrows in its quiver because it can test out things. And don't take premium processing as the dollar amount that I would suggest. I mean, it could be $5, it could be $10, it could be $20. You can try different things and see if people are willing to engage in a certain type of data input or a way of participating in the process that they could derive a benefit from that might actually drive down the internal costs without actually really putting a huge burden on the applicants themselves. I mean, I know that every time there's a change in the fees, we go through the same, angst, and it sets everyone's inner cost accountants free, and then that's great. But the reality is that I don't think people are as concerned with the fees themselves as what they think they're getting for that fee. I'm struggling to think of a commercial example. Okay. Redbox versus the now almost out of business Blockbuster, or totally out of business Blockbuster. What drove everybody nuts about Blockbuster? Not the fact that if you kept the movie for 5 days or 7 days, whatever it was, that you got a fine at the end, right? It was $1 a day. And what did Redbox do? They just came in and said, there are no fines here. We're just going to charge you $1 a day. You can keep as long as you want. Well, but that change in how I appreciate my interaction with you makes all the difference. So if I keep it for 20 days, $20. But I can't get mad because I did that. So I think there are ways of allowing the economics to move around to test what the tolerances are for certain groups of people to doing things in a way that might be more beneficial to the operating agency as well. So I think it's a flexibility, and I view it as a positive flexibility. Again, to end where I began, but it's not a license to go out and do whatever you want, at least in my direct experience.
Good afternoon, Cara Minetti with Task. First, I'd like to say I couldn't think of a better starting panel with representatives from CBP and USCIS and ICE to talk about immigration reform. My question is really technology-based, but starting with reform, the reform that the administration has been promoting, the Democratic Caucus for Immigration Reform, who I believe are embracing that. Do you see a change in technology? What I mean by that is, do you see a movement more towards, for looking at the border, UAS and UAVs, where, when SBInet came out, there was a move consciously, I think, to move a little bit away from those types of technologies while still being used by CBP, and moving more towards ground-based technologies like SBI. Does the reform that's in place actually drive the technology and procurement decisions that may be made down the road? Perhaps not, but.
Yeah, I don't know if there's enough information to make a determination whether that's going to drive that. I think one of the things, taking a look at the current deployment of technology, from my experience, there always needed to be the right mix. I don't think there was ever a vision, at least inside the organization, to to have a 1,900-mile area across the border, all with the same type of technology deployed. The risks are different, the geography is different, and as far as the threat that actually comes through those areas are all uniquely different. So some of the SBI tower-mounted technology was never envisioned to be across the entire border. Integrating UAVs to be able to provide that capability was part of an overall strategy, having transportable and relocatable type of devices, whether it be truck-mounted scope systems, the MSCs or the MSSs. Those were certainly immediate deployable capabilities you could put against a threat right now, and also then have the capability to move it. Because as I talked earlier, the adversary is very adaptable to what your defense mechanisms are. So as we started to see displacement because of operational activity, you want to make sure that your resources, whether it be human resources or technological resources, you can then move and address the threat that's happening. So having relocatable things are very important. You can do that with, obviously, mobile systems or aerial systems. That never should go ahead and be then concluded that you don't need to have the fixed capabilities, because there's going to be high threat areas or pathways that need to have a persistent stare. So you're constantly going to be able to lock down as much as you can certain parts of the border. So it's always been the right mix. I have not seen anything where the budget is going to continue to drive some of the comprehensive immigration reform type decision-making going forces, albeit I would say that there has to be some funding behind some of these decisions. You cannot go ahead and put that back on the shoulders of the men and women who are still in some of the agencies we represent to be able to do all the things that would be asked of them to have the right elements of the strategy or the pillars of the strategy. I would say, though, for my experience and for what my view is at this point in time, whatever the debate is at this point of what the final strategy should look like, this narrative of waiting until the border is secure, I would ask anybody in this room to give a definition of what secure the border means. And there's still some of my former colleagues in this room who will all give a different definition. So there's never going to be agreement on what secure the border means or operational control. And we grappled with that, and we had some very smart people and a lot of the think tanks around the city to try to help define that for us. And I think the conclusion from my experience is the border is pretty secure today. As I said earlier, it's not complete and more needs to be done. But we should not wait or let the debate rage on about is the border secure enough to begin the other elements of the strategy? Because I think there still needs to be attention and ability to address some of the other three areas that need to be taken care of as well. Just be careful as some of the announcements and some of the statements were made about what might be an amnesty program or a get out of jail free type of a program, because we saw some of those things in '86 which created a bit of a flood across the border. I don't think that's going to be the circumstances. And if there was any kind of a teeing up of people trying to make a mad dash across the border, I'm confident that the mechanisms that have been put in place, the resources, the investments, are substantial enough to be able to defend against that from occurring.
Interesting. Anyone else have a question? One more question. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Chin from Medill News Service. This one is for Mr. Ahern. I guess following up with the last question, how exactly would you characterize the effectiveness of UAVs for CBP, especially in light of the new Senate reform proposal that calls for more drone usage?
For the period of time that they were deployed before I retired, and keeping in some touch with the organization since my departure, I think they're a very effective piece of the strategy. I think, again, having the ability to move them with much more flexibility than we did before, because early on when we deployed them, the FAA actually was very restrictive on giving us the ability to fly them to various parts of the border. We had to have a COA, certificate of authorization, to be able to fly them in certain parts of the border for air safety. And I think there was a misunderstanding as far as how functional were these aircraft. Were they really unmanned? Well, these are ground-controlled, piloted aircraft. They're just not on board the drone. So to be able to go ahead and have these moving very flexibly across the border to whatever threat the Department of Homeland Security gives the capability for this country to be able to put those assets over top any type of a national concern anywhere in the country within a matter of a few hours. We did that during some of the hurricanes when there was a trio of hurricanes back in the Gulf region of Ike, Hanna, and Gustav. To be able to put the drone over top, to be able to put situational awareness back here to Washington, to any agency that had a need to know and to be able to see what was happening on the ground when it was too unsafe to be able to go ahead and put piloted aircraft over top. then the last piece is they're now being used for some of the transit zone activity. So you have 22, 23, 24 hours of capability on these unmanned aircraft to be able to get into deep transit zone coverage, to be able to follow, whether it be a semi-submersible or some of the other vessels making their way to the U.S. So it gives additional capabilities. So I think it's very positive. And I happen to be an advocate of going to the full number. I think it was 24 to grow from the 9.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. It was very informative and a great pleasure.
Thanks.